Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change. Usually, I always have the header, to be published ready, but since I feel and sense this will be not a generic, but more a fluid discussion, all I know is that that beautiful creature in the virtual room together with me, Alex, we will talk about personal transformation, most likely also talk about trauma, and she has to do with indigenous traditions, as well as working with like sacred plant medicine. And just to frame this conversation for those who are listening into my podcast for the very first time, so we're not doing this podcast for like super early beginners. I really want to nuance and differentiate this like exploding segment where suddenly everybody shows up as like a shaman or a tradition holder or offers whatever sort of ceremonies. So what brings me together in this room with you, Alex, is that I sense we're both appreciative, but also critical with what is happening out there in this like booming segment after 50 years of prohibition. So we're in the middle of the psychedelic renaissance, or some also call it the third wave. So I think specifically for this topic, how do you relate to the topic, and maybe what pieces in your biography, made you the person that you are and choose that life path? So before we dive into, let's say, more specific questions, I'm really curious to tell the audience a little bit like who you are and what made you chose this path.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you so much for having me on here. A great honor. And yeah, I really trust the space and what's going to come forward. And for me, I didn't actually choose this path. And I think that's a big distinction to make. I followed my excitement. I actually followed my left brain incredibly strongly at the start of this journey. So to give a little bit of context, I was a allopathic Western medic working in emergency medicine for 4 years on and off before I left medicine in 2017. So I'd been practicing for 6 years, and 2 years into that, ayahuasca found me multiple times. And at that time, I was a staunch reductionist scientist, show me the evidence or go away, I'm not interested. Very classical, very, very cliched. And again, ayahuasca kept coming and knocking, and I was like, oh, fine, for God's sake, okay, I'll try this medicine that apparently cares whether or not I've eaten pork. It's so weird, it's just crazy. And of course, my whole reality was blown wide open. And actually, then I went to the jungle and did a dieta. I think now, retrospectively, quite prematurely. But I was really being egged on by a few people who were actually the people who introduced me to ayahuasca in the first place, some Argentinian brothers in Mexico. And yeah, it was in the dieta that the shaman mentioned Kambo in the middle of what was the most horrendous series of ayahuasca ceremonies for me. And I said, no, I don't want Kambo. Whatever it is, I don't want it. I don't want any more of what you've got. and actually, it was when I was in London 6 months later that a friend of mine who is an accountant actually was like, do you want to do a Kambo ceremony in Deptford? Which is this completely random borough of London. It's like, what? And I remembered the word, and I was like, gosh, Kambo, I think I've heard that word, but was it? No. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, it's this frog secretion. And I'm specifically not calling it a poison or a toxin for good reason. And so essentially, I went down to Deptford and I tried Kambo, and I was very underwhelmed by the whole thing. I took a few dots, I purged, and I felt the same straight after. And I was like, don't know how I feel about that, to be honest. I was still very skeptical after my first dalliance with these medicines. And it wasn't until I went on PubMed, which is where all of the published medical papers reside on the internet, that you can access, and I typed in the Latin name of Kambo, Phylomedusa bicolor, and it listed all of the biologically active peptides. And this was 8 years ago now. This was long before anyone had really heard of Kambo very much. And I was blown away by what I read about one of the peptides specifically, dermaceptin, which is a very potent antimicrobial. It works on MRSA. It works on all kinds of cells that otherwise we find very hard to treat in Western medicine. And I always remember in my second year of microbiology, one of the tutors teaching us and saying, we are overdue a pandemic. And I was slightly terrified because at that point, just north of me where I was at medical school in Leeds, we had an outbreak of a multi-drug resistant strain of syphilis. And I was like, oh my gosh, can you imagine living in a post-antibiotic era? You know, anyone who's ever had an infected tooth will be like, oh my God, like that's the worst thing I can ever imagine. And yeah, so I was just like, you know what, I'm going to train in this medicine just because of that. Like, I'm going to have it in my back pocket for a rainy day. And that's the actual reason I trained in Kambo. It was not at all to really hold space ceremonially. And anyway, I'll stop talking there because I could talk for a long time now, but I want to give you some time to check in, perhaps.
Actually, I would like to, before we diverge and open up different pockets, because unbeknownst to many of my friends and listeners in the podcast, I've basically done the whole range of psychedelics, from ayahuasca to peyote to iboga to like anything, but I've never done Kambo. I never felt I needed it, but I'm really just super curious. I mean, I educated myself, I listened to podcasts, but since you're the first guest to ever take a deeper dive into Kambo, so yeah, let's please do so. And I'm happy, you know, if you continue where you were coming from the, let's say, Western medical standpoint of view, and then I'm curious how you segue into the, let's say, more the plant spirit or the frog spirit.
Yeah, so, and this is why I say I didn't choose my path. It chose me. Like, when one looks back retrospectively, one can see the linking of the dots. And so I was fascinated by dermaceptin, so I trained in it. I was fascinated at almost exactly the same time in my life after a breakup about the concept of what is a multiple orgasm? Like, what is that? I'm going to find out. So I went to Estonia and I did a 10-day tantric massage training course and learned about energetic orgasm. I learned about the energy bodies and so on and so forth. And also, when I was at school, I had sung in the school choir. And so I had this 8 years of choral music and learning how to sing and utilize my voice. And I'd always been invited to sing in bands and so on. And it had never felt true or right for me to sing in a band. I was like, to what end? To what purpose? It just didn't make sense, which is quite weird to most people. But to me, I was like, meh. So post my Kambo training, of course, everyone's talking about running ceremonies and stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll run some ceremonies. And that's when every single piece came together. And it was the first time I really would say in my life, probably, that I entered flow state in my work. And it was this coming together of realizing that the energetic practices I'd studied in Tantra could be utilized in the space from tree frog in the Amazon basin. It covers Bolivia, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and is utilized by many different tribes across the board. And it's used for many different reasons, from upregulating the immune system to managing pain to assisting childbirth to ... The panema is the thing that now we're going to start to branch out of physical things into the more energetic things. And it's what the Western mind would call depression, but they would call panema this energy, this dark cloud of energy that sits over you when you become depressed and you enter runs of bad luck. And they say that Kambo dispels this. And so it is this secretion that you burn you burn just the epidermis, the very top layer of the skin off, kind of like a blister. So blisters don't have blood normally, and it's like just using a little bit of incense and then pick off the epidermis, and it reveals the lymphatic system or the serous fluid underneath that. You then apply the dried medicine, which is sent from the Amazon on sticks, dried, and I reconstitute it with water. In the Amazon, they use saliva. They say that the peptides in the saliva actually complement the peptides in the medicine. And but in the West, that's not so acceptable. So I mix it up and then stick it on top of the puerta, the door, or the dot, as it's also called, the open part of the skin. And then it gets sucked into the body, and you essentially have a 5-minute prodrome where your whole body starts to go hot and fuzzy and buzzing, and you can start to hear your heartbeat in your ears, and everything essentially vasodilates peripherally, but centrally is vasoconstricting, sending your blood pressure up. And then what happens is the blood pressure drops, and at that point, I would say about a fifth of my clients do faint from the blood pressure drop. And essentially, at that point, a lot of people do start purging. But some people require quite a bit more medicine for unknown reasons, whatever their receptor profile is. And so at that point, I might apply more medicine or simply leave them at the amount that's the starting amount. And then it's a lot of water before and a lot of water during, at least in the Matses tradition that I trained with as a part of the IAKP, which is an organization that I actually left, but which did provide a very good training. And yes, it is intense. It's like having diarrhea and vomiting without the guaranteed diarrhea, but with guaranteed vomiting. And it lasts for about 45 minutes. And you have to really drink water, because the way I perceive this medicine is that it is scanning the whole system and it's flushing things out into the gut. And so you need water to keep either purging it up or sending it down below, or sweating, or some people maybe laugh or cry. Those are slightly rarer forms of purging, which is a word that is often used in the plant medicine community and is a word that is quite misunderstood by the average person who doesn't know anything about it. But purging is essentially vomiting. But we use the word purge because essentially it's a bit deeper than just a biological process of vomiting. When you're purging, you're releasing something, and that can be energetic, it can be held trauma, it can be, I don't know, whatever it is. It's honoring the process of acknowledging that there is a healing behind this vomiting. To me, that's how I perceive it. And so people purge and they drink, and then after 45 minutes, it's like magic. They do a final purge, and suddenly they come back and they're fresh. And it's almost like you have like HD vision and hearing, and you're very, very present. And some people want to go and like run a marathon straight after it, and I have to be like, just slow down, take some time, let it integrate. And it's an incredible medicine on many, many fronts.
What I find specifically interesting in our encounter, that neither one of us is like ditching, let's say, the Western paradigm, and there may be something about science, nor ditching, let's say, the magic or the mystic or whatever, the void behind everything. I want to stay a little bit on the science part. So when you said you basically, jumped into educating yourself and training yourself and then applying the medicine from the standpoint of view of, diving deep into PubMed, where is quote unquote Western medicine standing with Kambo?
Well, what Western medicine does, and science specifically, with the advent of Descartes, is that it likes to reduce it down. So what Western medicine has done, actually, I think deltorphin and dermaceptin, two of the peptides in Kambo, have been extracted and taken in a reductionist way away from the whole medicine of Kambo, which is a plethora of peptides, and have been taken and isolated into compounds that can be used in medicine now. And so it is utilized as analgesia, pain relief, and it's actually considered doping. Once when I was living in Mexico, I was approached by someone who wanted me to give Kambo to their horse, because what Kambo does is it actually upregulates mitochondria. It's incredible for. Okay, so I'll reverse a little bit. So it's called hunting magic in the Matsu's tribe, and essentially they would give it to hunters before they go hunting because it increases audio-visual acuity while also decreasing the need for food and sleep, and generally fortifying the system in the sense that you increase lean muscle mass. And the reason I know it increases lean muscle mass is I've had quite a few vegan bodybuilders who attended multiple ceremonies in a row for various reasons that were nothing to do with bodybuilding, but which after 2 treatments and 3 or 4 weeks of training later, everyone at the gym came up and said, okay, just tell me, you're taking steroids, aren't you? And he was like, no, I'm really not. I just been taking Kambo. And they were like, what?
I have to giggle here. No, I really have to giggle here. So I never took anything specifically for my weightlifting practice. It's really just funny to find myself in a room with, I think, one of the really few remaining, whatever, pretty well-known substances out there that I've not yet, applied or tried. So besides the reductionistic, taking the peptides out of the whole compound, so to say, and besides the doping and the pain relief, what are other signs from a Western perspective that Kambo is a good indication that people should try that substance? I mean, you were mentioning some quite severe problems people are facing in their lives, and where maybe Kambo makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is I actually moved away from this medicine quite a lot for 2 or 3 years because one woman died in Poland of a hyponatremic coma after Kambo. And then another woman died in Australia from it seems like it was probably a coronary artery arteriospasm. And so I got a bit spooked actually about this medicine. And when you think of the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people utilizing it, I mean, this is still very small amounts, but I really went deep into looking at any deaths associated with this medicine and just being like, really doing my due diligence because, first do no harm. But slowly the medicine has called me back. I've given it to at least now 1,800, 1,900 people. I lost count, and I've never had anything like this as a big problem. So I've mitigated where I could the situations where people have passed away. But essentially, one really interesting case was a man who approached me for a ceremony, and then I said yes. And then 2 days later, he called me up in tears and said, I have HIV and I have no idea how I got it. And it was really tragic, but also perfect because we decided to stick with the ceremony and give him Kambo because my teacher told me she had multiple clients with HIV who treated it completely with Kambo and not with any antiretrovirals. Because antiretrovirals, much like antifungals, they kill humans as well as the pathological thing. And so he came, and at that point his viral load was something like 80,000. It was really high because he was untreated and he hadn't known. And so he came to me, and in one dose of Kambo, the doctors did a repeat blood test the following week and he'd had no other interventions. His viral load was 42,000. Now, my teacher told me already it's amazing for the viral load, it drops it. And then what you find is if you then give them Kambo every month for about 6 to 8 months, the T cell count, which is how HIV then becomes AIDS, the T cell count starts to rise and it actually just goes up. And so people are utilizing this medicine, and there's no studies on this. This is all anecdotal from people I've treated and my teacher. But yeah, there's plenty of evidence on bloods, and I'm trying to think now of other scientific related findings. Nothing else is coming to my head right now. Just a lot of people that I've given it to ending addictions. A lot of people not coming for stopping caffeine, not coming for stopping tobacco, not coming for changing their diets, and then the next day waking up and just opening the cupboard and looking at the coffee and being like, I don't want to drink that. They're just really confused, or smoking a cigarette and being like, I don't want this anymore. And really miraculous in that way.
So it feels like an organic segue into another paradigm. Some call it the animistic paradigm or the magic paradigm, the indigenous paradigm. I don't really mind, but let's say something that's beyond Descartes and subject object dualism, and let's say thinking that we're all just parts of atoms spinning somewhat around. What's your say? And now, having worked with that medicine for 6 to 8 years and treated, if I remember rightly, so 1,800, 1,900 clients, and helped many of them, obviously. What's your say from a, let's say, plant medicine perspective?
When I perceive Kambo, it's like it's a green fire and it rips its way up through the system, like going through all the nadis, if you're looking at it from the yogic philosophical perspective, and it's ripping it up through the meridian system, if you're looking at the Chinese energetic perspective. And so I see it going through the body and essentially detecting areas of stagnation and sort of whisking them off. It's like it's opening the channels kind of by force. I'm not gonna lie. That's why it's fire, because it's like, like a forest fire when it and that's the main thing when you feel Kambo, which Alistair, maybe one day you will, and maybe with me, it's this energy of like, it's taking over and there's nothing you can do about it. You're like, right, I'm in this, holy shit. And it whisks around and it's just so powerful. And I would say that there are ceremonies where I have not felt the energy of Kambo as strongly. And then there's energies where it's like, almost like, poof, I can feel Kambo come in and it's in the space powerfully. And I guess what I would liken it to is I sat with the Huni Quinn and drank ayahuasca, one of the Brazilian tribes that work with ayahuasca. And they call in, I think it's the Yushibu. It's like everyone's like Yushibu, and then they are making all these sounds, and essentially they're calling in this spirit, and as they call it in, it's like you feel it in the space. And I would say there are definitely ceremonies where I've felt Kambo enter, and it's just like boom. And I guess we all have our higher selves, right? We all have this energetic quality that is like a transcendent of the physical form, but still somehow part of our energetic signature. At least I believe that. And in the lineage I train in, we have what's called a Wiracocha, which this is the Peruvian Inca Quero lineage, which I'm still really a baby in, but which I feel very strong affinity to. And the Wiracocha is like your 8th chakra. It's kind of like above your head by about a foot. And it's like you can reach into it and pull it down around you. And essentially it's like welcoming your higher self and all the memories of all of the lives you may have lived, if you believe in past lives. I'm still not completely sold on that, but it is this higher consciousness that is, really beyond the like going back to Descartes, this beyond the rational mind, beyond even intuition, beyond reaction of some even primordial sense. It's something deeper. And so Kambo, I think everything, and this is where we get to animist philosophy, I think everything really has this other quality. And I'm sitting opposite my drum right now, and this is a drum, but as a drum, it's part of a simulacra, which is a word that expresses a group that is held together by a group identity. So my drum is part of drums as a whole. And when I think of the spirit of, I can talk to the spirit of drums as a whole. Like you can talk to, how else can I describe it? Like the spirit of trees as a whole. Like there's a group, and there's a group of people from England or Germany. And so when I think of Kambo and the spirit of Kambo, it feels like there's this higher intelligence to the frog, which is the healing component of it and how it is interacting with the simulacra of the human race. And why it has come out at this time, specifically on the planet, along with all these other medicines. Who knows what the higher intelligence is? But yes, specifically when I work with Kambo, there is the physical component, and then I'm calling upon the energy of the spirit of it. And when it comes, I can definitely feel it.
I had a completely different question about the integration part, but I feel I want to do something which I've done in a couple of podcasts, but which I really think can really enlighten and not only teach the audience. And I will start a little bit so that you get the feeling for it. When people ask me, I've never done psychedelics or I have a little bit of experience, what would it do? Then I literally often tell the people it works on the chakra system. Then people who say, well, that sounds abstract. And I'm saying, hey, imagine you have a problem with self-love, or you have a problem of not being in love with your family, stuff like that. So that's where, for example, I personally think, even though it's a fully synthetic compound, where MDMA can be of great help. You know, I come from a trauma background. There's like a lot of things to say about MDMA. So I would say it works in the heart region. Or usually when people drink ayahuasca, which to my humble understanding is the only compound that opens up your crown chakra and the root chakra, the usual experience would be death and rebirth, right? At least if you do it like multiple times. Another one is then activating the solar plexus with peyote and connecting your heart space, like your love, with your willpower. So I want to stay in this like realm of the different bodies, from the physical body to the energetical body to the astral body to the body of infinity bliss, whatever we want to call it. Imagine you, not to convince me, but a guy that meditates since 27 years and has done hundreds of plant medicine ceremonies, where would you position the fire of Kambo in the simulacra? I very much resonate with the terminology of the simulacra. So really just curious, where in the mix does Kambo come in?
You know, I've never thought about that. And the term that got bandied around a lot at the very start of this kind of awakening of Kambo, I'd say sort of 2016, 17, 18, when there was like 5 practitioners in the UK and now there's like 500. It was Kambo warrior. Like, you're a Kambo warrior. And I feel like, kind of like I shared at the start, when it comes in, it flushes up and down the whole meridian system. And I guess at the end of the day, and like you said at the very introduction to your podcast, you know, multi-systems change is an integral thing. When we're talking integral theory, when we're talking spiral dynamics, everything's connected. But interestingly, because it flushes through the whole body, I would say it feels like it centers a lot on the solar plexus when I'm feeling into it. It's like, because the solar plexus is this place of power. It's this place of will. It's this place of like, oh, I can do it, you know? And that is the warrior energy that often, once you've met your edge, because Kambo, it's not like, there's no psychedelic quality, you know? It's not like, oh, that was nice. It's like you go in and you finish and you're like, whoa, what was that? And so, yeah, there's this sense afterwards of like, I can do anything. Like, if I can do that, I can do anything. But at the same time, what I would say, and the way that my teacher trained me, is after we've given the first dose, which traditionally in the Matsis tribe goes on the right lower leg for women and the left upper arm for men. From the second session onwards, you can actually put Kambo anywhere on the body. And one thing that has been incredible to witness, like crazy sometimes to witness, even as a left brain convert, I still get shocked sometimes by the energetics of a lot of the healing processes. But yeah, so for example, someone would say, okay, I've got issues with sleep. I'm generally stressed. I feel like my nervous system is not rewiring. It's just on high alert all the time. And I've also got some stomach issues. At that point, I would go, okay, let's put a dot on stomach 36, which is an acupuncture point on the tibialis anterior, on that muscle there. I'm like, okay, let's stick another dot on your reset point, which is actually an acupuncture point in the ear. I work with acupuncture points a lot. And then I would say, okay, and then let's put the rest on sleep. I don't know, whatever. Let's just say for this hypothetically, the root chakra. What you will see inevitably is that people will go through 3 layers of purge according to the energetic bunching of where you have placed the medicine. And now there's a lot of division in the Kambo Kambo community of like, it doesn't matter where you put it, the medicine's going to go where it wants to. And of course, we can never do a control study on such a thing because you can't have two people exactly the same thing, the same energetic systems, putting the medicine on at the same time. However, when someone's often a purge from up here will be clear, like nothing green, nothing yellow. And then Kambo often releases bile with it because you're fasted. And so the gallbladder contracts as well with the peptides. And then, so then you'll find when you go to the root chakra, you can often have a sort of brownish purge. Like it can get really deep, especially if there's deep trauma. I find that normally comes out as a dark brownish or light brown color. And then the stomach purge might be more yellowy green. And it's like you can read where it's gone based on what color it is often. And it's not always like this, but it can be. And so as a medicine, in a sense, because you can place it differently, I would say that the energetic centers it can impact is the intentionality and the location can really influence it.
It's often in my podcasts that I don't share that much from me, but I feel like in this podcast, it's more organic to share. So I think the only reason why I didn't do Kambo is it didn't show up. And I come from an addiction background. It was simply that, after so many years of sobriety and healing and therapy and family constellation work and subjectively being in the fittest, most sober, equilibrated version of myself, when then Kambo showed up a couple of years back, but definitely not more than in my circles. And I mean, I live in Berlin, much like you live in these international plant medicine, vegan, yoga, whatnot circles. It only started to show up maybe 3 to 5 years ago. So I would say my working assumption, because I'm totally open for it, it's not that I'm afraid or I say I can't learn. Obviously, you can always learn. My assumption also how I perceive you is if you are still stuck on the, let's say, the manomaya kosha, so the body made out of meat, flesh, or addiction, then it can reset the nervous system. My working assumption would more be if you're already integrated, liberated, or a clear conduit, then it feels almost this green fire. That's also how I perceive you, can basically loosen the layer in between the physical body and the energetical body. Hence, this like access to this like warrior energy that I think, at least that's how I perceive, we both share, and this like great passion to feel called. So one thing is like you choose it because it's fancy. The other thing is like what I'm doing has very little to do with what I chose and more what I'm told to do from various instances. I wonder if there's anything that you feel almost like summarizing Kambo, because there's more that I want to share and have a discussion with you on the podcast. Any final comments on Kambo? Maybe also some things where you would tell people, oh, this is an indication, don't do it. Or if people say they work with Kambo but they don't work according to a protocol, so almost like finishing that Kambo chapter.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because there are plenty of indications. Anyone who's medicated on epilepsy, anyone who's medicated on antipsychotics, anyone who's addicted to benzodiazepines, there's this quality when someone really wants to do something. And Kambo is very much like that. People are either fuck yes or like, why the hell would I do that? Or they're like, why the hell would I do that? And then they start dreaming and seeing frogs everywhere. And they're like, well, this is weird. It's like Kambo is actually calling me, even though they were like a hell no. And so there's this thing where suddenly you're called and it's almost like you get hell bent on it. You're like, I want to do it. And then what I've noticed in, for example, Vipassana meditation retreats is because they're very strict. They're like, if you have this mental health issue, then you cannot come. And I know plenty of people that have lied and still gone. And this is the one medicine I would say, absolutely do not lie. If you are addicted to benzodiazepines, for example, it can rapidly detox you. and cause seizures. And so this is a powerful, powerful, powerful medicine. It's not to be messed with. Don't, you have to have a practitioner who really goes deep on certain things that, again, medications for rheumatoid arthritis, pregnancy, it can cause, I actually once gave it to a pregnant woman because she didn't know she was pregnant. Thank God she did not miscarry, because Kambo actually can, anyway, we're tying up Kambo. We won't go in there. But yeah, it can abort fetuses. It does a lot of things, and it's not to be messed with. So take it seriously if you do want it, and make sure your practitioner asks you all the appropriate questions.
Before or finishing the Kambo chapter, in a psychedelic setting, you would say setting doses. So my question for you would be more like, I'm a client. What's the assessment? What's the treatment? And what's the post-treatment integration cycle? It's
good to have a clean diet for as long as you can, your whole life, if we're being really honest, but essentially at least 2 to 3 days before Kambo. No alcohol, no red meat, just a nice light vegetarian diet. And then the protocol itself will vary. My teacher got bit by a tick and she got Lyme's disease, where she got the classic bullseye mark on her leg. And she was like, am I going to give myself antibiotics for 2 weeks, or am I going to use Kambo? And she was like, I'm going to use Kambo. And so she gave herself Kambo every single day for 7 days. And then basically I think 3 months later, her test was negative for Lyme. So she doesn't have Lyme's disease. And so she successfully treated it. But to do Kambo every day for 7 days, anyone who's done it once would be like, oh my God, how could you even do that? Let alone to yourself. So, full respect to her. But yeah, every protocol completely changes. But the classic protocol that most people utilize, that comes from the town of Acre in Brazil, where initially Kambo was brought out of the jungle from the indigenous by the people who were actually tapping the trees for rubber back in the day, because they would be going off out into the jungle. And really, if you got sick in the middle of nowhere in a tropical environment, you're pretty much done for, And so they wanted to boost their immune systems. And what they were doing is taking the Vaccina de Floresta, which is the vaccine of the forest, which is Kambo 3 times in 1 lunar cycle. You take it once, have a week and a half or so break, again and then again. And that has been shown again and again with people I know personally. I also have administered to quite a few DJs who do international work, and they were constantly sick. And since Kambo 3 times in 1 month, they don't get sick. They just don't get sick. And it's remarkable. And so that is the classic protocol. But I've been a bit rusty. I've been focused a lot more on mushrooms in the last 3 or 4 years. And so I haven't been keeping up really with how the Kambo scene has grown and developed. And I'm sure there's protocols now for everything. But yes, and then integration again afterwards for 2-3 days. Don't take drugs. Don't drink alcohol, because it's just, there's still a lot of energy moving in the system, and you might actually think you're a bit superhuman, because people who have taken drugs, maybe say like a week later at a festival, or drunk a lot of alcohol, they didn't get hungover, they had no issues with metabolizing it, they were clean as a whistle and went straight back to work on Monday, and then it's a miracle. And I'm like, it's Kambo. But it's not to be utilized that way around, really. It should be respected, and you're trying to use it not to do that. So yeah.
Beautiful segue, since you were already mentioning the mushrooms. I wonder how we best open the space for the mushrooms. My gut feeling is I would like to position them within the overall segment of psychedelic testaments, plant medicine. I've had one of the deepest experiences of my life. Often, so in the setting we always did a full cycle 1 or 2 times of ayahuasca, and then while the DMT was still in the body, we did a kind of not super high dose. We did a meso dose, and then really just the room for the teaching, the download of the teacher, the channel the vessel, the joint spaceship, whatever you want to call it, was immensely powerful. So maybe we start with your own journey to mushrooms, and also educate the audience really, like, what's the specific context in the tradition, what's the setting doses. But nevertheless, within this conversation, which is again rather fluid in this specific podcast, how do you understand, let's say, the space that the mushrooms open, and nuance it to, for example, the experience you also have with ayahuasca?
So this is another case of not choosing the path choosing me. And I had two experiences. I believe it was the summer of 2016, where I was on either mushrooms or LSD, and someone came to me, or something started happening, and I was guided to either work with the tantric energy work I had described earlier, or do just some kind of, or they requested specifically body work. And what happened was, the moment I didn't either of those things, I went into trance, as I now understand it retrospectively, and essentially connected to an energy that did not feel like me. And I'll go into that in depth if you want. But essentially what then happened was, in both cases, that person, after a period of about 10 minutes, stood up and vomited. And it felt like something, like I, through whatever state I was in and open to, helped them move something out, which it felt like needed. They came to me, or I was guided to touch them, and it needed to come out. And actually it was, at that stage, I had done no shamanic training. I'd literally been running Kambo ceremonies and nothing, I was used to people purging in Kambo ceremonies, but not really on other medicines or in other altered states. And so that was really what inspired me to learn about, what is mushroom shamanism? What is shamanism? What even, at that point, I still wasn't really interested in shamanism that much as a concept. And I just went on this journey to Mexico, and that's when I hunted out a mushroom curandera, a healer, a female healer of South Oaxaca. And I sat with her, and I was really curious to learn more. I was like, what is this? What am I being called to? And I read about Maria Sabina, who is the Oaxacan curandera, who in the 1950s was hunted out by some amateur mycologists from North America, and who then became the gateway to the world re-remembering this third wave, essentially, of psychedelics. And I'm sure that story has probably been told a few times on this podcast. So yes, I really was amazed, and that started me on my journey. And at that point, and this is where I would say my ego definitely got the better of me on my path. And because in your list of bullet point questions that you sent me in such an organized fashion, Alistair, it was like, what credits what was it? I can't remember how you phrased the question. What qualifies you to do this work? And I think actually, when I look back retrospectively now, I very quickly jumped the gun on mushrooms. And I think looking back now, it was much too fast, really. And, when I look back and I think, why did I do that? Why did I go in? I think there's some interesting things here. And one was Jamie Wheel's concept. I don't know if you heard Jamie Wheel talk about the kind of super ego that can come from psychedelics. And we see this a lot in the scene. And I saw it in myself at this stage in my path, where there was a grandiosity. It's like, oh, I've, given Kambo to this many people, and it's great. And I was a doctor, so I kind of know what I'm doing. And I think, and at that point I had quite a social media following, because I believe very, very deeply in destigmatizing these medicines, and also in harm reduction, being very careful and making sure getting to the right people at the right time without harm. So I was voraciously sharing my journey at this stage. And of course, as mushrooms popped up, it was like I was sharing just la 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 la, like from my heart, very innocently. And what happened was, people then started reaching out to me asking, could I hold space? And I started saying yes. Whereas at that point, I think maybe I should have said, no, I'm going to go study this a bit more, or get some psychotherapeutic training or something. But for whatever reason, I think this grandiosity had got the better of me. I just went straight in. And I think ultimately that's what led to a very deep burnout in 2019. I was working at Synthesis Institute in the Netherlands, which has recently actually gone bankrupt, but which was really the leading international gold standard in psilocybin therapy, and they had launched a training actually the last few years, which was doing very well. So it's a real sadness for the whole community actually, but also a good lesson in terms of how quickly the startups are actually trying to grow in this industry. But I digress. Yeah. So yeah, I went
Can I
and was.
stay here? Because
Yeah.
I think it's beautiful that you're digressing. No, I'm really very grateful. It's for the first time in my podcast on this specific topic. So, and I need also a short moment to sense into this vulnerable piece. I personally see so many supercharged beginners. So in a monastic tradition, like let's say Zen Buddhism or so, you would anyhow, whatever, need to train 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and then show up. And there's something very specific with the psychedelic experience for those of us who dare to go really transpersonal and really encounter Godhead, unity consciousness, samadhi, whatever we call these also transient phenomena of like, wow, we're actually, everything is connected with everything. All is good, all is happy, which then spurs this grandiosity, this supercharged, often pretty narcissistic egos. So what touches me is that you're mentioning it yourself, basically having fallen into this trap of prematurely offering your services, but then also encountered a roadblock. So I feel really this is a very precious point in this encounter, because it seems then also this roadblock, this burnout you were mentioning, was ultimately something that you really took serious. So yeah, I'm curious on both your learnings for yourself as well as then for the audience. How can an audience who has never done any ceremony or has very little experience differentiate between the tens of thousands of offers there on Instagram everywhere and apply their own due diligence towards those that at least have, if not mastery, then a deeper understanding or a critical, view on a deeper learning before they offer ceremonies?
Yeah. So what happened in my burnout was, and I give a lot of credit and thanks now to my body, because I was finding myself co-leading retreats because everyone wanted a doctor on their retreat because it looks really good. Like you become an asset to an organization when you have credentials, essentially, regardless of your actual skill set, it turns out. And so what was happening was my throat started to kind of contract and I couldn't sing. And I'd been singing my Icaros. That was the last part of actually how I was guided to Kambo. Was finally I realized what my voice was for. It was for singing Icaros, which are a way of moving energy in people to facilitate healing and purging. And when I was working at Synthesis in the Netherlands in 2019, actually my throat was just contracting. Like my body was like, you are not ready. You are not ready. It was this constriction. And so I just had to slow down. And what then emerged was 2 years of therapy, 2 years of shamanic training, slowing down, going much quieter, sharing a lot less on social media, really like doing some deeper inner work, which it turns out I had literally scratched the surface of. And of course, I thought I was enlightened after like 10 ayahuasca ceremonies. This is really like cringy to look back now. But yeah, and gosh, I think if I was approaching this as someone who really hadn't got a clue, I would be interested in not like the number of ceremonies my facilitator has held or their credentials per se. I'm really interested in like their own understanding of themselves. Like, how much therapy have you done? If you studied psychotherapy or you became a psychiatrist, have you ever had therapy yourself as part of your training? Like, have you done deeper somatic work? What kind of self-work have you done? Like, I've done so many deep dives now in the last 4 years since this burnout, deep into my somatic mapping, deep into realizing much deeper well springs of how my body is responding to anything in each individual moment. And that has made me a much better space holder, much less projection, much less need to even contribute to the space most of the time. Now I really just leave it to the mushrooms most of the time. But without that shamanic training, without a teacher now who I consider to be someone I can go to and ask questions when I don't understand, at that point I was really like a cowboy. If I'm honest, I was like, I just had no one. I was answering to no one, and I was in love with this image of myself. It's really, I'm happy to say it. I'm smiling because it's just like, I have no shame like about that. It's just, it was, and it informed me, and I'm very grateful. And now I'm a better space holder. But at one point, I did truly, I think 2020, just completely let go of the whole path. I was like, and I think that's quite a good question to ask your space holder too. It's like, have you ever really doubted that this path is your path? And if they say like, no, da, 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 and then it's a bit like, maybe, because it's hard and it's not easy and it takes everything. And it's, yeah, but those would be some of the starting questions.
So the only thing, not a cowboy, a cowgirl. So let's
say
go
that.
into the magic alchemical cowgirl perspective. Since you have a broad array of inner work as well as different psychedelic experiences, how would you describe the audience, the room, the space, the energetical frequency, and also the healing potential of mushrooms?
Mushrooms are kind of these, they call them the little children, or the teachers, the little teachers. And it's really, I guess they are little physically, but there's also this kind of like elfish duende energy, which is what the Spanish call like the gnomes. And they have this kind of, I would call them capricious, not and that can sometimes be a derogatory term, but in the sense that they are very like changeable. Like whew, sometimes you can sit with mushrooms and it almost feels like ayahuasca. And sometimes you can sit with mushrooms and it feels a bit like San Pedro, I would say, like a mescaline containing substance. And each strain also, I think this again is a very Western lens to look at medicine through, that we're like ayahuasca versus mushrooms, but actually they all have different strains. Each brew is completely different from another. There's a massive mixture of different plants within it. There's the intention of the shaman who brewed it and the prayers they said over it. And so, we're really dealing with a massive cocktail of energetics going on here. But mushrooms, it was ayahuasca that really changed everything for me. And I would say it was like a loving sucker punch. It was like, poof. And it's funny you mentioned the root and the crown, because I never heard that, and it makes complete sense. It was like this kind of boom up through my root that kind of like poof, like enlightened my head in a sense. I'm putting it together now. But mushrooms, they're kind of more like, I can't describe it. Like if you could see my hands on the screen, it's this kind of wiggling, like in and out kind of, it's almost like an infinity. That's like they weave in your body and they can take you in a lot of directions. And that's actually a criticism that many people have of mushrooms, is they're almost a bit too chaotic sometimes. And it's like, especially in large doses, and it's kind of like there's too many things and it's a bit too much and people can't make sense of it. And they're almost, they've got that kind of heyoka energy, the joker energy. And the heyoka is a Lakota word for the jester. And so, yeah, mushrooms have this capacity to take you into like the depths of like despair. And then suddenly there you'll find like an eruption of laughter. And it's just like, they can be quite wild. But at the same time, sometimes I take mushrooms and I feel like I become the owl, and I can just sit very, very, very still and
Actually, I
yeah.
actually love this. So it's, people say I'm the jester, whatever. Yes, and maybe I also got 6 times a Virgo in one house. So anyhow, let's stay. I really want to stay on this energetical plant spirit level, because I've never shared that in a podcast. My sense is that once you obtain a certain mastery, in the sense that you know what these compounds do from a Western perspective, from an Eastern perspective, you start to, not Eastern, from an indigenous perspective, you start to dance, communicate with the plant spirit. Um, I really have the feeling there's a reason why they call it the children, like in all the at least Middle and South American traditions. I especially found it very potent. And there's also a brew that they do in the Netherlands, which is called Ayahuasca, which I've never done. But again, in the way that I was trained, we always did at least one, more often two times in a night ayahuasca, and then a mild dose of mushrooms. And then what happened was just this Zen-like cathedral wide open space. But since it was a mesodose, this was then really the space to go in front of, in my case, the woman, like I would say more like a medium, and give you like a reading and look into your energetical body and stuff like that, or like train your clairvoyance in like seeing into the other energetical bodies of the people with whom you're doing the training, and then training yourself where you see a contraction in the other person. So I found that incredibly powerful, certainly for people that maybe can't follow anymore. My very first psychedelic experience was with mushrooms on a pretty high dose, and was a very beautiful, completely transpersonal, just nature mysticism, just like crying of joy, how beautiful a tree and a grasshopper and a leaf and a river can be. Um, yeah, anything, because I still have a third topic that I really want to get like very groovy and live and interactive with you. Anything that you have to share with the audience on mushrooms? And when you do that, please also at least say something on setting doses, assessment, intervention, integration, contraindications, at least briefly.
I maybe I'm not as advanced as these people who work in the way you just described. Like I don't, um, yeah, that sounds very nuanced what you just described. And there was a time when when I first was in my grandiosity and I was taking some mushrooms too, and with my clients, and I've stopped doing that now because firstly, I've actually started getting what I call a contact high. Like I find it very hard to tell the time when my clients are on the medicine. I always have difficulty. Um, so yes, I'm really just leaving them to it with the medicine, with the medicine themselves. Like I do some shamanic healing work on them before. We often do Kambo the night before that, and then we have some integration calls afterwards and the day after the medicine. But really, when a client is with the mushrooms, like I do not want to get involved. It's about empowering them to realize that they are having a conversation with like the deepest part of themselves, and they have everything they need to heal themselves. And when my clients tell me, you know, they're just there like sobbing for hours, and I don't touch them unless they really want to. I'm like, it's up to you. And then amazing stories of clients being like, I had this black mass in my chest, and as I was crying, I was just releasing, and I sent it out the window, and it was gone, and I sent it to the sun, and I'm like, great, you just did your own extraction, good work, you know, and it's like, hands off, you know, more and more. But yeah, I don't know what else to say about mushrooms. I find them very mysterious. I don't want to pretend I really understand them at all, if I'm really honest. I don't know what else I have to say on them.
All good. Alex, since I would say in that sequence, sustainability is very on vogue. So everything is now sustainable. Obviously, Coca-Cola, you know, Procter and Gamble. Suddenly, all of the evil ones are sustainable. Then I would say, secondly, everything psychedelics, you know, especially in our scene, is on vogue. And then lastly, at least in the last 3 to 5 years, anybody that does anything with the hashtag indigenous or indigenous wisdom is like the super pro. So also to my audience, I'm a newbie in the field of indigenous. I only work with 2 tribes and never lived for a longer period of time with them. It's literally just one of my nonprofit projects with the Hunikuin that I help to support to raise funds for a big private land reserve in the Western Amazon in the state of Acre. And I've also, besides in a ceremonial context, spent very little time with Indigenous. So there's no specific question. It's more like, what draws you into that direction? What are some of the learnings, maybe also that were like counterintuitive, with your Western mindset? And then maybe lastly, just to open a tapestry of a conversation. Lastly, I have the feeling often either people are fig leafing Indigenous or they're putting them up on a pedestal. And I think the truth is in the middle. These are very vulnerable populations. Many of them are threatened by whatever, war, extinction, exploitation. They're marginalized. They have really worst case third world problems. So I think all we want to do, at least me and you, I reckon, is like help them and at least preserve some of their body of knowledge and wisdom. So yeah, this is not a question. What draw you into the Indigenous field? What are your learnings? And yeah, maybe some critical words on how you perceive this whole scene of change makers and social entrepreneurs suddenly, like putting Indigenous wisdom everywhere.
It was plant medicine that drew me into indigeneity, which, if you listen to Pat McCabe talk about the word indigenous, she's like, I'm happy to call myself indigenous. I'm proud. It just means I'm of this land. But if you speak to the Mazatec elder that I work with, who I really sought out as, number one, a teacher, but also someone I could give remuneration to for essentially what has been extractive colonialism of their sacred plant medicine and knowledge of Maria Sabina back in the 50s. I don't know how I feel about the term biopiracy. I don't know. To me, I know that in Brazil you can't advertise Kambo because it has been considered now that there's some law passed that it was a form of biopiracy, and therefore I'm not exactly sure why you can't advertise as a result of that. But certainly there's an energy of extractivism that has happened in these cultures that, for me, as someone who works with medicines that I only know about because of Maria Sabina, I just naturally want to give back. Like, that's it. And I think I've overthought this to the nth degree, much like you, Alistair. There's a lot of care and consideration given to, am I doing this for the right reasons? What are my motives? Am I creating more harm than good? And at the end of the day, it's like, these people are really grateful. Like, I'm supporting this Mazatec teacher I'm working with to build an orphanage, which one of these kind of psychedelic hedge fund managers actually offered to give $25,000 to, because I requested it. He said, well, who could I give some money to? I'm like, you could give it to this project. And for a while I was a little bit concerned. I was like, should I give it in small chunks, or should I give it all, that if I gave it all in one go, would it cause more harm than good? If, we know that when people win the lottery, if they get lots of money in one go, they normally just self-destruct. And so I thought, and I really thought long and hard about it. And at the end of the day, it's just, the money's getting to her. We started at $2,000 increments, and then we just realized there was too much bureaucracy on the end of the PA who was having to send it. And so we just started sending it in $6,000 amounts. And, every week or two, I'm getting updates on how the orphanage is being built, and it all seems to be going really well. And I think it's trusting. But I've also heard actually situations of, money that has been donated meant to be going somewhere, but then it doesn't go there. And then people are like, oh, well, now you've got me this money. Can we have money for this and this and this? And it all starts to get very confusing and murky. And it's Trisha Easterman, I think is her name, Trisha Eastman, who's a very vocal psychedelic advocate and works with, I believe it's Iboga. Yeah, she's an amazing woman from North America. And yeah, she had some real issues with the Huirarica, the peyote shamans and tribes of North Mexico. And it started off as building a well, and then it became very confusing quite quickly. And so I took a long time because by the time I reached Alejandrina, my teacher, my Mazatec teacher, I'd met two other Mazatec women who were spaceholders. And this comes back to this whole concept of lineage, which I think is so glamorized at the moment. which I'll go into in a second. But essentially, yeah, I'm a discerning person, and I'm sure you are too. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are. And for me to hand over to sort of bow down before someone and say, teach me, it's like, you gotta fucking show me that you're worth learning from, you know? And so I spent, 2 weeks with Alejandrina before, and I saw how people responded to her and her environment and how much respect she had in the community and the work she does. And I was like, yes, you've earned my respect. I will, yeah, but you can teach me, And so I only really worked with someone. I decided to start working in that way with someone who I truly wanted to create a true relationship with. We're friends first and foremost. But I think this is something that when we start talking reciprocity, it's not about money being exchanged. There's also friendship. Like, they're humans at the end of the day. There's no pedestalizing going on here. It's like, I can only create self-esteem in myself by doing esteemable acts. And I can only, really want to work with someone when I see how they are and how they move. But if I come from a stance of self-worth too, then it's not like I'm below that person. And anyway, that's a longer discussion in terms of like gurus and things like that, which I've never had a guru, and I don't really feel the need for one. But yeah, for sure, Alejandrina is my friend first and foremost, and I respect her deeply. And we text and we send each other emojis and silly gifs as well. It's not all serious and this and that. And I think, a lot of what, thank God, the plant medicines have taken me to hang out with, the Wirarika and the Mazatec, and then a conference actually that was nothing to do with plant medicine, but there was a lot of plant medicine facilitators there. I met a Dakota man called Manape, really, really cool man. And, just a lot of these people that I just reach out to and chat with every now and then. We just catch up and we shoot the shit. We talk, he tells me about the history of like various like elders from his tradition. And with Alejandrina, we just laugh. She invites me to the wedding of her friend. And I think that should be the foundation of any reciprocity, remuneration, decolonization action, is friendship. And so that's what I'm trying to start with, at least. And maybe I'm just stumbling my way through. But I think at the end of the day, this orphanage is being built, and it's all good so far. So yeah, but for sure, there's big funds. I don't know if you've heard of River Styx, the foundation. River Styx from the States, and then they created something called the IMCF. There's something, Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, and that's an amazing app which has been created by some philanthropists. And I know Laura Dawn, who has been my coach for some time, and she runs the Psychedelic Leadership podcast. They created this app so that people could donate to various tribes and communities of the Indigenous through this app. And I know that the IMCF, have a team of anthropologists and scientists and people who go into these communities, and they really ask them, like, what do you want? What do you want from this money? Often the white man comes and goes, you need that. It's just like, well, no, like, they know what they need. And who are we to, if again, we look at spiral dynamics, you can't just go from magical thinking to green level thinking or teal level thinking. You've got to go up the spiral. And like, who are we to tell a tribe person that they need to jump 4 stages of natural human evolutionary consciousness? It's like, but that's a much longer conversation than that was.
That's definitely another conversation. For today, since we shared a professional encounter, a magical encounter, and also a personal encounter, as the last question, since I always coin these conversations as a sensing into the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead, what are the 2 or 3 pearls of wisdom, both from Kambo as well as let's say plant medicine with the specific typology of the mushrooms, that give you hope when you look at the current state of affairs on the planet?
I think that a lot of these medicines have shown me how wise the body is and how it tends towards healing. That is what the body wants. And much like you can have a quantum leap in consciousness, you can also have a quantum leap in healing. and I guess they're the same thing, but healing, someone might have had a long-standing issue for a long time, and suddenly with these medicines you can unravel it very, very, very quickly. And so these medicines give me deep hope, because of my own personal experience of a quantum leap in consciousness and healing. And I think that that's what humanity needs right now, and that's what is available to everyone. And that's what I would like people to know, really, at the end of the day, that like you are capable of healing. Like, you know, you might have a blip of grandiosity in the middle, but as long as you keep doing the work, you should get through it. So yeah, just don't be afraid of these medicines. Don't be afraid of your own subconscious, because one day you too could be able to laugh at your own grandiosity. And I think that's where everyone needs to be. We need to be able to laugh at ourselves, and so that we can start to have the kinds of conversations that are going to change the world. Unless we're happy to look stupid, unless we're happy to do things a bit differently, unless we're happy to, you know, stick our head above the parapet, then nothing is going to change. And these medicines help you do exactly that.
Thanks so much for this beautiful conversation, Alex. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alistair.